December 2018, my wife and I spent 5 days in the hospital with our little girl, Maisie. She was just over a year old at the time. She had been sick for a few days and we just thought it was the normal little kid's cold. And one night I was laying with her and I felt a lump behind her ear on her neck. It felt like it was the size of a golf ball. And I tried not to panic and freak her out. I tried to stay calm for my wife, but I was so scared. I remember immediately saying silent prayers to God, please God, don't let this be serious. We took her to the emergency room that night. They did all the tests and scans and eventually found that she had an infected lymph node. They would have to do a procedure to drain the fluid and give her antibiotics. This was probably the hardest thing I have ever gone through as a parent. Not having answers, trying to calm down my baby girl, being scared and feeling like I have no control. I just remember crying out to God in desperation, begging for Him to protect and heal Maisie. And if I'm honest, my prayers of desperation were also surrounded by frustration and angry questions towards God. Why? How could you let this happen? The procedure went great and her lymph node healed and she hasn't had a problem with it since, but we will never forget that week. And I'll never forget the prayers that we prayed. I'll never forget those moments spent with God. Today, we're in the second week of our Isaac series, and we'll be reading in Genesis 25. But before we start our reading, we need a little bit of context. Isaac is the son of Abraham, who we learned about in our last series. God promised Abraham that He would use him to start a great nation, and that his offspring would be blessed and inherit the land. Abraham and his wife Sarah were repeatedly promised children, and eventually they had Isaac when they were really, really old. Isaac was the son that God asked Abraham to sacrifice after he waited years to finally have a child. Abraham trusted God and was faithful and was ready to sacrifice his son, but God saw his faithfulness and had him sacrifice an animal instead. Through Abraham and Isaac, God's people had the promised land. God's promise included the descendants of Abraham and Isaac. So I can imagine that Isaac was also under some pressure to have children, specifically a son, so his family line would continue. This is where we pick up in Genesis 25, verses 19 through 21. This is the account of the family line of Abraham's son, Isaac. Abraham became the father of Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean, from Padan Aram, and sister of Laban the Aramean. Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife, because she was childless. The Lord answered his prayer, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. At first glance, this seems pretty simple. Isaac married Rebekah at 40 years old, and he prayed to God for some children, and God answered his prayer. It's that easy. His prayer was answered. All the pressure of having a son to continue his family line is gone. But to understand his prayer and the story, we have to keep reading, picking up in verse 24. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. The first to come out was red, and his whole body was like a hairy garment. So they named him Esau. After this, his brother came out, and with his hand grasping Esau's heel, so he was named Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when Rebekah gave birth to them. Not only did they have a son, but they had twins. That's amazing. God is so faithful. He answered Isaac's prayer for children and blessed them with 2. Oh, but it took 20 years for them to have children. This part is so often looked over because if we just read the beginning, it seems so simple and so quick, but it wasn't. It took 20 years, longer than any of you have been alive. How many prayers have you been praying for more than a week, a month, a year, 5 years? I'm guessing the answer is either 0 or maybe 1. So often our prayers are so immediate and demanding that if they aren't answered in the time frame we give God, then we just move on. I can't imagine waiting 20 years for anything, because during moments of desperation, When you're crying out to God for an answer, every minute seems like an hour, every hour seems like a day, every day feels like a week. I remember those days in the hospital just waiting for someone to come in and give us an answer, trying to entertain a 1-year-old and not knowing when we can go home, not knowing if my little girl is gonna be okay. Waiting is hard. And it's easy to just feel like God isn't listening or He has forgotten about you. This frustration or anger builds up inside of us so quick. We have to remember that God doesn't operate on our timeline. We have to have faith that He is at work, trust that He is in control, and ultimately, we have to stay faithful even when we don't receive the answer we were hoping for, and if we don't receive an answer at all. How faithful are you being in the midst of your desperate prayers? And are you doing everything you can in the times of desperation? I remember when I was younger thinking that I just had to ask God for something and He would just do it. I asked God for a new bike and my parents bought one. I asked for help to beat a new level in Sonic and God came through. I begged God to tell my parents to let me stay the night at a friend's house and they did. Just ask and you shall receive. And I know you're probably laughing at me right now, but let's be honest. We still kind of view our prayers like this. God, please let me pass this math test, even though I haven't studied at all. Please, God, let this girl say yes when I ask her to the dance, even though I've never talked to her and I'm not sure she even knows who I am. I'm begging you, God, I just want my license. Please let me pass this driving test, even though I've hit 2 cars in the parking lot trying to learn how to parallel park. And if you're in Glendale, make sure to ask Dwight about parking because he knows all of the tricks. We want God to do all the work while we sit back and cross our fingers hoping He just gives us what we want. Sometimes our prayers need to be followed with some action. We have to meet God halfway. God hears you. Maybe He's just waiting for you to show some effort, to put in the work. God, if you hear me, I really want my friend to come to church with me. Well, have you asked? Have you told them why you go? Have you shared who Jesus is and what He means to you? There are times when we have some control in the outcome of our prayers. There is some work we can put in. We might have to step out of our comfort zone or have a hard conversation. But how badly do you really want it? Then there are times when we have no control. There's nothing we can do or say. It's all in God's hands. We just pray and wait and then pray some more. We cry and beg and cry some more. Our faith gets tested. We might get angry. We feel alone, unheard, unseen. We wonder, God, are you there? Are you even listening? And there's a hard truth here that we have to think about. When we feel like God hasn't answered our prayer, has He actually answered us? And was the answer no? This idea is so hard to wrap our heads around. It's really difficult to process. Some of you have begged God to heal a sick family member, and He didn't. Someone here has cried out to God asking Him to save your parents' marriage, and they got a divorce. Some of you might pray a prayer of desperation to get into a certain college, and you won't. And you feel like God has abandoned you. You feel unseen, unheard. You question if God is even real. And so often we don't think that maybe God's answer was no. And this is tough, and it hurts me to even talk about it. Isaiah 55 says this, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than yours, and my thoughts than your thoughts." We don't have access to the bigger picture that God is looking at. We can't possibly know what He is working out. This truth doesn't make it any easier, but it's true. And somehow we have to come to terms with the idea that God did answer our prayer. He was listening. He did see you, but the answer was no. And I'm so sorry if something tragic has happened in your life and God didn't answer your prayer of desperation. I wish I had the reason why. I wish I could tell you the bigger plan God was working on for you. All I can say is that I truly believe that we serve a good God. I believe He has no intention of causing you pain and suffering. I know that He has a greater plan for you in your life that you can't see right now. I know that He will stay faithful to you. We have to continue to bring our desperate prayers to God. We have to believe that He is looking out for us. He sees us. He hears us. We find some hope in Romans 8:28, which says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who believe Him, who have been called according to His purpose." We have to stay faithful and continue to pray even when we feel like we've been waiting for 20 years, when we feel like we can't wait another day. We have to lean on the people around us that God has placed in our lives when we don't receive the answer we were hoping for. Keep moving forward, trusting that God has a plan. He is still working because you are a child of God. He sees you, He hears you, and He loves you.